Shalom, everyone. Um, Welcome to my broadcast of a weekly Parashah portion. So we are doing Parashah 18, which is titled Mishpatim, um, which in English is translated rulings. And so we are continuing to go through the journey with ancient Israel, going through the wilderness. Um, and learning God's various commandments, and of course, the giving of the covenant on Mount Horeb, or what's also known as Mount Sinai. So, having said that, let's go ahead and dive in. Okay, so we are picking up at Shemot, or Exodus, chapter 21, and it will go all the way from verse 1 to chapter 23, verse 13. So quite a large amount of scripture here for this one heading, which is ordinances for the covenant. I will summarize what is covered and try to weave them together when possible, um, and give a little bit of insight. So the first part of this section goes into treatment of servants. Now you'll see it. Some of the translations will say slave. Um, However, um, the children of Israel did not enslave each other. However, they did have what's called indentured servants. So generally, you became a servant if you couldn't pay off a debt, um, or you couldn't afford to pay something else, and so you had to sell, you know, unfortunately, a child or something into to servanthood. You could be born into servanthood, um, and so they're all things like that. However, there were ordinances for how those treatment of slaves or treatments of servants, excuse me, um, was conducted, and also when they could be freed. We'll read later that it's not just in the seventh year that all males go free, but you also have the year of Jubilee, which is the 50th year, where everything reverts back to its original owners. Um, and we'll get into that later on in the Torah. So, so males go free in the seventh year. Now, you will notice here there is kind of a separation in some ways on what happens with males and what happens with females, but overall, they are to be treated with respect. And we will see later what happens when they are not. So, God is concerned even for those who are indentured servants. While they are paying off their debt, or working to pay to live to begin with, God expects those who are over them to treat them with dignity and respect. So males go free in the seventh year. Males leave with what they came in with, including family. So if these males became servants and their whole family went with them, obviously because he's the head of the household, they all were indentured servants. When he is set free, he leaves with the family that came with him. Now, however, if his master gives him a wife and she bears children, when he leaves, he does not leave with them, because he is property, basically, for lack of a better term, property of his master. When he leaves, the wife and children that were given to him are kept by the master, because he has been set free, is no longer part of the family. Now, the only way he gets to keep his wife and children is if he decides to be a servant to the master for the rest of his life. And so to do that, there was a process where they would go ahead and pierce his ear through with an awl against a door. It was like saying that you are permanently attached to this household and will never leave it. So it was better, obviously, not to become an indentured servant. It came with a lot of downsides. including the risk of being mistreated, along with if you happen to have a wife and children while you're indentured that are given to you from the master, you do not get to leave with them unless you would agree to serve him for the rest of your life. Now, with females, they stay servants unless, so let me kind of backtrack here and kind of paint a picture. So when males go to become servants of a master, it's a different situation. Whereas females, when a master chooses them, and it's like she becomes a wife to him. Okay, so I want you to kind of get that picture in mind. When a male master chooses a female to be a servant, she basically becomes like a wife to him. And so she stays unless she is mistreated. So if she's mistreated, she gets to go free. If the male chooses to have another wife in addition to her, that female servant cannot be sold, and she cannot have her rights diminished. She is treated as a wife. Now, harken back to what happened with Abraham, with Sarah, and with and my mind's went blank. Oh my goodness, and with Hagar. Excuse me. I kind of went blank on that for a minute. Um, so uh, so with Hagar, even though Hagar was the servant of her mistress Sarah, when Sarah gave her to Abraham, she became a wife also. Even though she was still a servant, she was also a wife and was given also marital rights. It's kind of the same thing here. So when this male master takes a female servant, um, she becomes, and it's kind of implied, it doesn't outright say it, but she becomes a wife, and she cannot um, be sold away, and she cannot have her rights diminished because there's another wife in the family. Okay, so there's a little bit different deal going on with the males. Obviously, if a male's in a household with a male master, he's not going to get married to him. So in the seventh year, he goes free. But it's a different circumstance with a female. As it implies, a male cannot take a female servant to himself unless he actually marries her. And there's probably a lot of good reasons of why that should be that way. If he's not willing to marry her, he shouldn't take her as a servant. I know it's a kind of a weird dynamic and it's uncomfortable and things we're not used to here in Western civilization. And even in some contexts in Eastern civilization. But this is how things were back then. If you could not afford to pay a bill, or you could not afford to actually, stay alive, and you couldn't get didn't have your own land, whatever happened to be where you couldn't take care of yourself, your only choice was to become a servant. And so, as a servant, you were taken care of. You were supposed to be well treated while you were employed, for lack of a better term, to your master or your employer. However, the relationship between male master and female servant was to be one of marital and not otherwise. And a main reason for that is because if there wasn't a marriage involved, then you had probably the very decent possibility of adultery being involved. And so, to prevent that, the male who wanted to purchase or not, wanted to take the female servant had to be willing to marry her in addition. Okay, so let's move on. So moving further than that, if a person causes another person to die purposely, they are put to death. And you're going to see a lot of things here where it says are put to death. There is a reason for that. God is very serious about keeping sin and wrongful behavior out of the camp of Israel. Why? Because he dwells in the midst of them. And so he will not stay around um, people who purposefully sin. Um, you'll learn later on in the Torah that there are sins that are done um, without um, purposely trying to, and there are sins that are done with what's called a high-handed nature, where they are done purposefully without regard to God's commandments. Thank God that He's the Father. Thank the Father He sent Yeshua, because otherwise most of us would probably be worthy of death on this planet. Now, in the on this earth. Now, in the world to come, we're all worthy of death, eternal separation from God. But here on earth, especially if you're Jewish under the covenant, a lot of these sins, these high-handed sins, were punishable by death. So God wasn't playing around. He took His holiness very seriously. He took the holiness of His people. He took to Himself seriously, and that's why these penalties are so harsh. It is to stop sin in its tracks. Now you may say, well, that's using fear instead of love. Well, here's the thing. If these people really love God, they won't do these things. However, if the love is not enough of a motivator, then fear of death will be. Okay, love should be the primary motivator, but if for some reason, even that doesn't persuade them, then fear of death should. Okay. Okay, and notice the key word here, if a person causes another to die purposefully. Okay, there's the operative word there, purposefully. They are put to death. Anyone who does not take precautions to prevent someone's death after being warned about dangers with animals, or whatever happens to be, is also put to death. Okay? Again, the thing is that these people either purposefully hurt someone or ignored when they were warned point blankly about a danger and chose to do nothing to mitigate it to prevent someone else's death. All right, where property dies, such as animals or servants, they must be compensated for. So, if something dies of somebody else's, it has to be compensated for. Usually, whenever compensation took place, it wasn't just a one-to-one compensation. It usually involved a penalty, sometimes a steep penalty, in order to really drive home the fact that the person who caused the damage needs to not let it happen again. It needs to hurt enough to where they don't do it again. Okay? All right. And one thing else to point out, all of these rules, as we see, rules, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. All of these derive from the 10 words or the 10 commandments that God gave to Israel. These are the specific ways of fulfilling what was encapsulated in each of the 10 commandments. Okay. So, if something is stolen, it is compensated for plus a penalty. However, if someone is kidnapped, so a form of theft, right? If you're kidnapping somebody, you're stealing. The kidnapper is put to death. So you're seeing here, there are different levels of theft. Some of them are stealing things or possessions. Other times, you're actually stealing people, which rises to a higher degree in this world of death. Okay. If something is destroyed, they compensate for with the best of their own or equivalent plus a penalty. So when you do it one-to-one, exactly one thing for exactly the other thing, or for example with crops, if crops are set fire, you were to give the best of your crops to replace what the other person lost. If the perpetrator of a crime can't be determined. So sometimes we can't determine who committed a crime. So in that point, you're at an impasse. So the plaintiff and the defender both brought before God, and he himself, working through the priests, decides who the guilty party is. Okay? Um, so we go on. If a man seduces a virgin, he is to take her as his wife, and he must pay the dowry. Okay? So when in normal circumstances, if he does that, he's automatically taking her as his wife. Now you may say, well, what if she doesn't want to be with him? Um, I think eventually it comes to an impasse to where she will probably eventually leave him, and go back to her father. It's a lot of unfortunately, man making a wrong decision and impacting someone else. No, it is not fair. It's not good. It but um, when the man takes the virgin, takes the wife. Now remember back then, things were looked at a little bit differently. Um, so the man always pursued the woman. The man was always the one who always took the woman as his wife. The man is the one, doing the pursuing and the taking and things of that nature. Um, and that's just how it was. And so when he takes her as when he seduces her, um, that union there is not just a physical union. It is a spiritual union. It is a covenant union. Okay. When people go around nowadays, and when they're sleeping around with everybody, each person they're sleeping around with, they're making a covenant with, and they're breaking that covenant when they go to somebody else. So that union, that sexual union, is a covenant. Um, as soon as you do that act, you've already sealed a covenant with that other person, with that either it's a man with a woman or a woman with a man. That covenant is sealed, and you've basically made a marriage covenant at that point. And so this is what that rule is getting at, is like when you do that, you've basically taken her as your wife. You have to take her as your wife because you've already made that covenant with her. However, and here comes the point. Here's the if. Okay, let's say the woman goes back to her father and says, "This is what happened. This what happened," and she pleads with him, "I don't want to be with him. I don't have any desire for him. He's horrible," or the list goes on. Her father can go ahead and say, "No, she will not go with you," and that will get the wife away from that guy. It would be an example of her father defending her in a way he couldn't before. But the man who did that, still has to pay the dowry. Now, what is a dowry? So, a dowry is basically was a set amount of money. To um, it was something to compensate the family of the woman he's taken as a wife, because um, while the woman was not married, she worked in whatever family business there was. Whatever family business there was. I remember back then, many of them had their own fields. They had their own businesses, and so businesses, they were all a family affair. Everyone participated in the business. If they were farmers, everybody participated in the field. Okay, and so this wife, when she leaves, and a lot of people say, well, she's paying, the man's paying for a wife. That's not what's happening here. What's happening is that when the man takes that wife, that woman is no longer helping with the family business. And so the family is compensated for their loss with the dowry. Okay, a lot of your feminists and things like that get it twisted and think, oh, this is just you know, a woman being treated as property, and that's not what's going on here at all. Um, it is the fact that uh, the reason why the dowry is paid is because um, the woman is leaving the family and is no longer helping the family with whatever business the family is conducts. Now you must say, well, why doesn't a wife do it with a man, or pursue a man and a wife pay a dowry, because back then the man pursued. The man is the head of the household. Still today, he's the head of the household. That does not mean he is a ruler, a lord, or anything of that nature. His duty. The man's duty should be to protect the family and provide for the family. That doesn't mean the wife can't help provide, but it is the man's duty to provide and to protect his family and things of that nature. And so it was usually the man who pursued the woman and paid the dowry to take her as his wife. Okay, I know there's a lot of things I just said there, kind of chew on that, let that be. However, one thing I want to kind of emphasize and really nail home here is that this is not a thing where a woman is being treated as property. Okay, I want you to get that out of your head, and I want you to read through the scriptures, not letting that enter your head. Now you may say, well, then I'm reading it blind. You're not reading it blind. I want you to read it without a bias that other people from reading the text assume. I don't want you assuming or having bias entering in when you're reading the text, because if you do that, you're not going to get what the text is trying to tell you. Also, I also encourage you, as you're reading through this, read up on Israeli culture, ancient culture, how things worked back then. Because if you don't understand the cultural context, some of this won't make as much sense as it should. Okay, so again, when you read the word, you don't just read it like you're reading a novel. You're reading to study. You read to understand. You read to go ahead and understand culture. That way, when you're reading through the text, um, you when you're reading through the text, you are understanding it from a cultural standpoint, and you're understanding it from a circumstance standpoint. Okay, so enough time on the slide. Let's go ahead and move on. Okay, so some other things here. Sorcerers are not to be allowed to live. Okay, again, another theme that is there's certain things. There are many um, high-handed sins. So sorcery is considered a high-handed sin. Why? Because you don't just accidentally become a sorceress. Okay, you can't accidentally become a sorceress. You either commit sorcery or you don't. And so when you commit sorcery knowing that God is against it, that's a high-handed sin, and that's punishable by death. Same thing with bestiality. Okay, you don't just happen to do that. If you do it, you're doing it purposefully, knowing that God is against it, and it's punishable by death. When you sacrifice other gods, you don't accidentally sacrifice other gods. Oops, wait, look, I just sacrificed an animal. Oh, darn. That's not how that works. It's a high-handed offense, and it's also punishable by death. Okay? Again, thank the Father for Yeshua, right? Only because of what his sacrifice allowed us to be forgiven for things that would not be atoned for under the old sacrificial system. All right, moving on. So, outsiders will be treated with the dignity denied Israel during the slavery in Egypt. So, in other words, God said, you know what it's like to be outsiders. Treat them as you want to be treated. Treat them how you should have been treated in Egypt. Okay? And if you treat them how you want to be treated in Egypt, you'll do the right thing each time. Widows and orphans are to be provided for. And if they're not, if they are taken advantage of, because they're some of the most weakest, let me interject here. So why did God hate the Amalekites so much? He did because they would go behind ambush, not other people groups, including Israel, and they would go ahead and prey on the weakest of their societies. And so that was of the utmost egregious behavior to God, was to prey on those who are the weakest. And so God here is emphasizing again that you will take care of widows and orphans and treat them appropriately. And if you don't, I will see it and I will get angry and I will punish those who are mistreating them with death, and their death will in turn their wives into widows and their children perhaps into orphans. Okay, so God was very serious about that. Okay, we are not to treat our brother and sister, who we lend to, who we help, the same way we treat those who are outsiders. Okay, it is permitted for Israel to charge interest to those who are outside, um, who are not part of the community of Israel. However, they are not to charge interest when they lend to their brother or sister. Not only that, but they are also not to deprive them of a living while they are in debt to them. Okay, so for example, if they take their cloak for collateral during the day, they have to give, if that's the only thing they have to sleep on and cover themselves up with, they are to return it to the person in debt to them at night. If this person is mistreated, God will hear about it. He will be gracious to them. And it does imply that he will punish the offender. Okay, even though they are indebted to you, you are to treat them with respect. If they can't, if they die because of hypothermia, or if they can't eat and die from not eating, how are they going to repay your debt? They can't. They're dead. So it makes no sense to go ahead and deprive them of a living if you want them to repay the debt they owe you. Okay. Do not despise God or curse the rule of the people whom God has appointed, despite their behavior. Now, I find a link there between do not despise God or curse the ruler of the people whom God has appointed. So, in other words, the rulers, and it says this in the Parashah, the New Testament, that the rulers are there as God's judges. The rulers of the people are there as God's judges. Not just the rulers of the Jewish people, but any of the rulers of any of the nations are there as God's judges. Now, can they be sinful? Yes. Can they be wrong about a lot of stuff? Absolutely. But you are not to treat them, you're not to curse them, and you're not to wish their downfall. You're not to wish their ill will. Now, a lot of times our flesh says we want the worst things to happen to these rulers because of how horrific they are. However, despite their behavior, we are not allowed to curse them. Okay, we are there to pray for them. Remember that Shaul or Paul in the Parashah, he talked about praying for our rulers. Okay, if you want them to be better, pray for them. Okay, and as Yeshua said, bless and do not curse. There were no buts. There were no ifs. There were no anything like that. No kind of conditions on what he said. He said, bless and do not curse. There were no conditions. Okay? He said, in doing that, in blessing and not cursing, becoming peacemakers, you become the children of God. The best what we can be. Okay, another thing God talks about here is bringing to him the best of the first fruits and the firstborn, both man and beast. So God gets first of everything. Everything God gets first of. Okay, if it's the stuff that comes out of the earth, he gets the best. He gets the best of the first fruits. He doesn't get any damaged stuff. This is what got Cain in trouble, by the way. When Cain brought forth the fruit of his labors, he just brought forth stuff. What Abel brought was the best. Okay, there's a difference here. Yeah, Cain fulfilled the letter in a respect, but there was no good. There was nothing. His heart was not in it. He was not there to give God his best. This is what God's talking about with the first fruits. Yes, you bring forth your first fruits, but you bring me the best of your first fruits. Don't bring me the damaged stuff or the bad stuff. You bring me your best. And then for the firstborn of both man and beast, you bring forth the firstborn of a man, and then you would also bring forth the firstborn of the beast if they were not temple or tabernacle worthy, they could be put to other menial labor. There's things they could do with them besides that. Um, if you're talking about the firstborn of a man, it talks about later in Torah that no one with certain defects could appear inside of the tabernacle or the temple, including even once the firstborns were redeemed and the Levites replaced them. Um, and so God expected the best. Now that doesn't mean he despised um, men who had defects and couldn't enter the temple. It just means that they could not participate in that capacity. Now, a lot of you would say that's not fair. God's being temperamental. God's penalizing somebody for something they couldn't help. Um, but we have to remember that our bodies are corrupted. Some of us are born with birth defects and with other things, or if somebody had a crushed male organ or whatever it happens to be, God did not want them serving as priests. Okay, they could not serve as priests with that happening because they had to be um, some level um, of don't want to say perfection, but completeness to perform the priestly duties. And so God values utmost His holiness. It is not God's fault that man corrupted themselves and then had the outflow of sin going through all of mankind, including producing birth defects, stuff like that. That's not God's fault. Um, and so He is fully justified in requiring the best to be brought before Him. But it does not mean He despises that which is not the best. There is a function and a location for everything, and one is not better than the other. One is different than the other. Now you would say, well, isn't the person serving as priests better than the ones who are not serving as priests? That is a false equivalency. Okay, the person serving as priests is not better than the ones not serving as priests. It's a different function. It's a function they were chosen for, not that they earned. Okay, let's go ahead and move on. It also talks about newborn animals are so basically this is a grace and a mercy towards the mother of the newborn animal, that animal is allowed to stay with the mother for a week or 8 days before it can be taken from the mother and used for whatever purpose. Okay. Now, as I'm going through this, you have to forgive me if I don't articulate things like I should, or if I miss something, or if I interpret something that may not be completely accurate. And this is again why I tell each of you every week that you need to read the word for yourself, because God may show you something that I missed, and iron sharpens iron. So if you're reading it and the Spirit shows you something, and through your studies and through your research you find something else out, that's something to add to the conversation and the study of the Scriptures. It does not mean the person who didn't see it wasn't listening to the Spirit, or is not as not as worthy to teach, or whatever else that people do that, because we like to rank people, right? Those who know more are better. Those who see something somebody else didn't is better. That's not what this is about here. This is about all of us contributing as best we can by the Spirit. Okay, God says we are to be a holy people for Him. Therefore, we are not to eat animals that have been killed by other animals, just left on on the side, like a carcass or whatever. Maybe some animals ate some part of it and left part of it laying there. We're not to eat that. Usually they are filled with bacteria and other toxins. They're not good for you at all. So they're not to be eaten. And the reason why is you're damaging what Paul called the temple of the Holy Spirit, our bodies. You're damaging your own body by eating something that God is telling you not to eat. Okay? Now there'll be people that will say, "Oh, we don't know why God made these rules." But if you read through, you think about your research, and you really sit there and pray about it, it's some of these. Yeah, I will admit some of the rules are kind of hard to understand, but a lot of them make sense, right? I mean, you're not going to go by the side of the road and see a skunk laying there. First of all, they're not kosher, but second of all, you're not going to sit there and start eating off its dead carcass that's already been chewed on and run over and everything else like that. I mean, that's dumb. You're going to get sick and probably die from it. Okay, this is what God's talking about here, taking care of our temples. All right, you're not to bear false witness. You're not to follow a crowd to evil, and you're not to take sides in an argument unobjectively. Okay, these are all forms of bearing false witness against your neighbor, which is one of the 10 Commandments we just talked about last Parashah. Okay, um, so again, we don't lie. We don't follow a crowd to do what's wrong. I don't care how many you're doing it. It's like that old adage, if everybody jumped off a cliff, would you do it too? Well, obviously we wouldn't, and unless we've got a death wish on ourselves. Same thing here. We don't follow a crowd to evil. Doesn't matter how many's doing it. What's wrong is wrong, regardless of how many are doing it. And then again, you're not to take the sides you're not to take sides objectively. So what does that mean? So a lot of times, let's put in today's example. So if we had a rich guy who took a poor guy to court and was suing him, almost all of us would immediately want to take the side of the poor guy. Why? Because that guy's rich. Okay? We automatically associate him being rich with being evil, with being sinful, with being greedy, and all the other things we associate. And we associate the poor guy with him having a hard lot in life, with him being taken advantage of, and things of that nature. Okay? However, God is telling us not to look at things that way. We are not to look at that way. We are not to assume anything. We are to listen to both sides and decide objectively, which is what a judge is supposed to do. They're not supposed to take any consideration into uh, how that person appears, um, that person's lot in life, or any of that nature. It's to be taken into account only the facts of that case. All right, you are to help everyone, not just the ones you like. Um, it was Yeshua who said that if you help or do things for those who you love, well, that makes you no different than everybody else. And if we're believers and we do that way, well, even those who don't believe do that, right? We are to help everyone, even your enemies. It doesn't matter. Okay, and I hope all of you out there who believe in Yeshua and who follow him and read the Parashah are starting to see that all the sayings and things you're seeing that Yeshua spoke, they are coming directly from the Torah. I mean, I've already seen a bunch of them just in the last couple of slides we've actually been through, and so he is not just pulling this stuff out of thin air. He is taking it directly from the covenant that Israel made with God at Mount Horeb, or also called Mount Sinai. All right, judges are not to accept bribes. That's kind of like a duh, right? You don't accept bribes, and you don't, and the witnesses are not to accept bribes either. Why? Because that's what they call perverting justice. If you're taking a bribe to side with a certain party a certain way, that is not hearing a case objectively and deciding objectively. Okay, so now we're going to start. We go into a little bit of Shabbat here. So, man and the land are both entitled to Shabbat, just in different ways. Okay, so for man, every seventh day is a day of rest. For the land, every seventh year is a year of rest. Okay, and so both man and land and beast along with man are all given Shabbat. So all creation, if you want to think about it that way, is given a Shabbat. Okay, they are giving a time to cease. Why? Because everything in creation needs a time to recuperate. Everything, from man to beast to even the land. If you keep using the land year after year after year after year after year, you can deprive the land of nutrients, and then you won't be able to grow anything. So what happens is that every 7th year, it lies what's called fallow. And during that year, um, whatever's there is allowed to grow and then rot and fall to the ground to refeed the ground nutrients. Animals will come along and eat from it and will go ahead and do their business and refertilize the ground. And so the ground's allowed to rest and to receive back nutrients that were taken from it from the other 6 years of planting. Okay. Then God goes into saying to stay so far removed from idol worship that the names of those idols are not even spoken. Okay, in other words, their name shouldn't even be on your lips in a positive or worshipful manner. They should be actually kept out of your mouth. Now, obviously, if you're doing research or you're learning, you know, this is kind of hard here because there's arguments to say, well, you don't need to do any kind of research into that because you don't need to know the ways of pagans. That is true. However, you also need to know when we're spreading the gospel of what you're actually arguing against. And Paul even talks about plays to those in Acts that he understands the philosophers and the different idols and stuff like that in Greek culture. So obviously, God didn't mean never ever say the name of that. What he's talking about here is that they should not be spoken in high regard. They should not be spoken of in worship, things of that nature. Again, here context is important. Context not just in the Torah, but throughout the Tanakh and also throughout the Parashah to kind of actually give more insight into what a particular verse is saying. Okay, so we move on into the next heading, which is 3 harvest festivals. Actually, this part is kind of brief. The actual talking about the 3 harvest festivals, but that's what the heading is. And that goes into the mid part of chapter 23 to the end. So there are 3 feasts which all men must appear before Adonai every year. So it's a feast of Matzot, which it includes Pesach, and then the feast of Shavuot, and the feast of Sukkot. Okay. In English, that has to do with the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which includes Passover, the Feast of First Fruits, and then also the Feast of Tabernacles. The Feast of Matzot takes place in spring. The Feast of Shavuot takes place in summer. And the Feast of Sukkot takes place in fall. Okay, so for the Feast of Matzot, again including Pesach, no hametz is be eaten or in anywhere in your house or involved in any sacrifices or anything. No hametz for 7 days, but especially you're not supposed to include hametz in sacrifices. Hametz, excuse me. Also, all men, we talked about that already. Now, just because it says all men must appear before Adonai, that is not an exclusion statement. It does not mean that women can't come. What it means is at the very least, all men must come. Okay? All men must appear. However, women and children can also come as well. They are perfectly welcome. God is giving a baseline here, not a an exclusionary statement to where only men can. All right, none of the Pesach sacrifices remain until morning. We actually talked about that earlier in Shemot. Um, the best of the first fruits is to be brought in from what was planted during Shavuot. It's just a kind of the first harvest. It has to do with barley um, and other planted first, like early harvest um, items that are planted. And then for the Feast of Sukkot, this has to do with that which is planted later. Again, first fruits. I guess you kind of look at Shavuot as the first or the early harvest, and you can look at the Feast of Sukkot as the last harvest or late harvest. Okay. This last one may seem kind of like an outlier, like why in the world was this interjected here? But again, it's another mercy of God towards the mother. So you do not boil a kid or like a goat or a juvenile goat or baby goat and a sheep lamb in its mother's milk. And the reason why it's a kind of a psychological thing. You got to think from the mother's standpoint. If she saw that happening to her child, um, what will be going, what kind of trauma that would be for that mother. And so God, in a mercy towards, because God is gracious and merciful toward all His creation, um, that He makes that prohibition. All right, moving on. So God does something interesting here, and we have seen this several times throughout the Torah, beginning with um, Abraham. So it's a warning to heed the angel of the Lord that bears His name. Now that's a key point there, and that's actually more poignant, I think. Well, in ways, it's more poignant than actually the angel of the Lord appearing uh, to Abraham at his tent. But it says that this angel Lord bears his name. Okay, and if they don't listen, he will not spare them. It will be him that goes ahead of them and defeats all of Israel's enemies as Israel's obedient. Um, and so this angel Lord is to many believers in Yeshua believe that this is the pre-incarnate Yeshua, that the Messiah has been with Israel all along, even from the time of Abraham. That the pre-incarnate Yeshua, the Messiah, the Word of God, has been there um, in angel form during the Tanakh, and then as in human form um, in the Parashah. But in both instances, 100% God. Okay, so let's see here. Israel, as part of their obedience, is to utterly destroy all idols and pillars. So when they get to the land, they are not to leave any of it standing. It's be completely destroyed to where it cannot be repaired, cannot be stood back up, and where it does not become a stumbling block to the children of Israel. So now what's interesting is that God, after this, it doesn't say this is why, but it makes sense when you read through this of why God says you don't need the idols and you don't need the pillars. Why don't you need the idols and why don't you need the pillars? Well, because I will bless your food and your water. I will take your diseases away. I will give you fertility and I will give you length of days. These are all the things that the Canaanite culture, our peoples, sought from their gods. Okay? And so God's saying, you don't need any of those false idols and pillars, those false gods. I will provide all that for you. Look to me. Okay, and then God goes on to talk about the land. He says, I will not drive out all the enemies at once, but little by little I will drive them out. Otherwise, the beasts will replace the peoples that were that were driven out. And so instead of having to fight, the Canaanites, we fighting, back then, lions and bears and massive dangerous beasts, um, instead of the Canaanites, which would be almost just as dangerous as facing the Canaanites. Not only that, but also think about that the land at least was somewhat tamed in the areas where the Canaanites resided. If God drew them off at all one time, and Israel was not able to go and fill those areas fast enough, it would become overgrown. Um, Remember that God gave them all the vineyards of the Canaanites, all the different plants, all those different things were there in the land that Israel never planted, never did anything with. It was a land already set there with everything they would need. All that needed to be done was to actually remove the prior inhabitants who were sinful and doing abominations before God. And so, but if they were all driven out really quick, then all those vineyards, all the things that are sitting there would overgrow. They would become not taken care of. Beasts would eat them, and also attack the Israelites. So it was better that God drew them out little by little instead of all at once. Okay. So then God goes on to talk more about the land. He spells out Israel's borders. Now you may notice if you know about anything about geography in the Middle East right now, that the borders that God gives to Israel are not the same as what's listed here in Shemot, but also back in Bereshit, and when it was told to Abraham. So God says here it goes from the Reed Sea or the Red Sea to the Mediterranean, and from the wilderness to the Euphrates. Okay, so for the most part, it kind of follows that nowadays. But that northern part that goes Euphrates is not. As a matter of fact, if I remember correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong, I don't believe it's that the northern extent of Israel's territories ever extended all the way to the Euphrates. Now, there are some who said because Israel didn't stay faithful, they were never able to go that far north and make it that far. And that will be in the millennium when Yeshua returns, when Messiah returns, that the full length of that land will be realized. All right. Also, while they were in the land, they are not to make any covenant with the inhabitants or their gods. Okay. Now, when we went up, we will be more inclined to show mercy to those in the land. But God is saying, do not show them mercy. You are to utterly wipe them out. You have to make a covenant with them, with their gods. You are to destroy all their pillars and their idols, and you are to destroy the inhabitants as well. Understand that these people there had gone beyond the point of redemption. They were past God being able to reach them, and all they would be is a snare to Israel. And that actually ends up what happens, by the way. Israel leads some of the people there. They also have the incident of Balaam of Beor. And so there's these things happen, and exactly what God warns them about ends up taking place because the inhabitants are left in the land and not totally taken care of like God warned them to. There's actually an infinite incident where the Israelites make a covenant with some of the peoples of the land, and then God holds them to it. He said, "No, you can't go back on it. You made a covenant with them. You cannot go back on it. Now you must uphold it." Okay, so the last part of this parashah has to do with the cutting of the covenant at Sinai. So God calls Moshe, Aharon, and his sons, and the 70 elders of Israel to worship from afar, but they're not to come close. They're to stay down towards the base of the mountain. They are not to come all the way up. Okay, they are not to enter the cloud. Now, before that happened, before they actually go up, Moshe comes back down and relays all of God's commands to Israel. And again, they agreed to it. It's the second time that Israel has agreed to God's commands contained in the covenant. So Moshe then wrote down all God had said. He built an altar, and all the young men. Now remember, then all the young men were serving as priests. You had not got to the Levitical priesthood yet. That will happen here, I believe, next Parashah. Okay, and so they were used. So young men, each of the young men, usually the eldest sons of the families, served as priests to Adonai. Okay, and they represented all the people in their families. And so each of them sacrificed to the Lord on behalf of themselves and their families. So that blood was split in half. Half of it was splashed against the altar. The other half was sprinkled on the people. And so what that did, look at the blood. So we often look at blood as a covering, but what really the blood is a binding agent. Okay, that blood is used to bind the people to the altar and the altar to the people, and then them to God. Okay, so they are bound to God through the altar, from which sacrifices are continually made to renew that binding of God with His people over and over again. And then during that time, Moshe read from the scroll where all of God's commands were listed. Okay. Now this is not the tablets of stone. This is the various commands we just went through here in this Parashah that have been written down in those scrolls, or in that scroll. Okay, so again, the people again agree to all that God has commanded. That's the third time? The third time they've agreed to what God has commanded. So once that is done, the party mentioned earlier, Moshe, Aharon, and the 70 elders and Aharon's sons, all go up to the mountain. Okay, and they actually get to sit, beholding the God of Israel in all His glory, and get to go ahead and fellowship with Him at a covenant meal. So they actually sit and have a meal before the God of Israel, and it's a covenant meal. So if you remember, back in Bereshit, Abraham had a similar meal with Abimelech when they made a covenant. Now this is not, this is a different kind of covenant, but there's still like a covenant meal here where they're eating and fellowshipping with each other and with God, and eating the covenant meal. So after this meal, God then calls Moshe up himself, and he writes, and he's going to write the covenant on the tablets himself. So God himself is going to write these on these tablets. Okay. Now you remember later that these original ones are smashed and new ones are made, that Moshe cut stone for, and Moshe writes it out. However, with these, God Himself provides the tablets and writes on them Himself. Okay, so while Moshe is gone, he tells them Aharon and Hur, which we talked about before, is most probably Miriam's husband, are left in charge of all of Israel while Moshe is gone. So Moshe goes into the cloud, and he is there for 40 days and 40 nights, beholding God's glory as like a consuming fire, receives the tablets from him of the Ten Commandments, and then we will go on from there. Next Parashah. So, if you have any prayer requests, you can go ahead and send them to that email address there on the slide. I'll be more than happy to pray for you or any of those you want prayer for. As always, please go ahead and just give me your first name, the first name of the person you want prayer for. I don't need to have any specifics about them as far as personally identifiable information. Just keep it short, succinct, and to the point, and I'll be more than happy to pray for them or you. So I hope you enjoyed this study. Again, I know I already mentioned it once in the during the study, but please go and read the scriptures for yourself, do your own research and study. Allow the Spirit to reveal to you things that He may not have revealed to me, and that way you can grow not in just in your knowledge of God and your knowledge of Israel and a knowledge of culture and things, but also coming to know God in a personal manner. So that is it for this week. I hope you will go ahead and watch next week's video when it comes out. So brachot to you and Lala Tov.